Paul Alexander, an American citizen, suffered from a terrible disease at the age of 6. It was a severe case of polio. He survived but had since been locked in a special iron tube called iron lungs. Today, Paul is 77 years old, and this is how he lives his life. It was incredibly hot in Texas at the time. The temperature outside didn't go below 38 degrees Celsius. The state virtually died out. Outdoor pools, cinemas, and cafes didn't work. Churches canceled their services. People locked themselves in their homes trying to escape the heat that didn't subside at night, while the cities got sprayed with the DDT insecticide, a mosquito repellent. However, what the people of America were most afraid of wasn't the heat or the mosquitoes, but the terrible epidemic of polio, which claimed the lives of hundreds of people every day. Most of the deaths were children. During the polio epidemic, a total of 58,000 people got infected, of which over 21,000 were left disabled and 3,145 died. Paul Alexander was 6 years old when he was playing in the yard one hot but rainy day. Suddenly, he started feeling unwell. His neck hurt and his head was pounding. He ran home to his mother, forgetting his shoes at the door. All sweaty and dirty, the boy ran into the kitchen and called out to his mother. Any other time, she would have scolded him for bringing dirt into the kitchen, but not this time. Seeing her son's feverish face, the woman sent him to get his shoes and told him to immediately get into bed. She knew right away. Paul recalls that day, still wondering how. The boy had a fever and aching pains in all of his limbs. After the initial examination, the family doctor advised the family not to take the boy to the hospital, as it was overcrowded with other patients with the same diagnosis, and assured them that Paul had a better chance of recovery at home. The boy didn't feel too bad in the early days of the disease. He even found the strength to draw. However, he did realize that he had a serious illness, so he spent his days coloring his favorite cowboys, page after page, as if there's no tomorrow. On the 5th day, the boy's condition worsened. He could no longer move, swallow, cough, or speak. Having arrived at the hospital, the mother had to hold the boy in her arms, as there were no free beds. Chaos reigned at the hospital. Doctors were running from one room to another, and children were crying everywhere. Meanwhile, Paul was only getting worse. A little longer and the boy would have died. Fortunately, a doctor running by noticed that the boy was in critical condition and took him straight to the operating room, where he performed an emergency tracheotomy to suck out the fluid from the lungs that his paralyzed body could no longer remove on its own. When he woke up 3 days later, the first thing Paul heard was some strange sounds, like an iron machine squeezing and trying to breathe. He opened his eyes and saw that his ears didn't deceive him. His body was encased in a metal cocoon. And not only him, there were thousands of kiddos just like him in a huge hall, all of them locked in devices with the unusual name iron lung. The iron lung is a type of negative pressure ventilator in the size of a person. The pressure inside this vehicle is different from atmospheric pressure. By alternatively lowering and increasing the pressure, the device allows pumping the air in and out of the lungs of a person who cannot breathe on their own. The prototype of this machine was created back in the 19th century, but was improved in the 1950s when the United States was hit by a polio outbreak. The boy spent 18 months in the hospital. His body was completely paralyzed. He couldn't breathe on his own. Doctors thought that he would die, but Paul wanted to live. Seeing his will to live, the boy's parents took their son home with the iron lung and started learning to live anew given their new conditions. The boy's parents hired a physical therapist who taught Paul to swallow air, directing it into the trachea with the help of his tongue, like a fish. This type of breathing allowed him to leave the device for several hours. Paul managed to study by using his memory only, since he couldn't write anything down. At 21, he became the first person in Dallas to graduate from high school without actually attending any classes. By the way, he almost had perfect grades. The only B he got was in biology, and that was because he physically couldn't dissect a frog. Doesn't sound fair, does it? Well, it wasn't. Paul got very mad and tried to argue his case, but eventually he had to accept the situation. After getting rejected repeatedly, Paul nevertheless managed to get into Southern Methodist University in Dallas and then in the University of Texas Law School in Austin. "I was going to be president," he said in a recent interview, very ambitious. As we all can see, he didn't become president. However, Paul was considered a successful lawyer in Dallas and Fort Worth for decades. He represented his clients in court in a three-piece suit and a modified wheelchair that kept his paralyzed body upright. Paul always wanted to speak for himself. One day, his father invented a special device for him, a stick with a pen tied to its end. This device allowed the young man to take notes and type, and later, this stick became his most important tool. He learned to use it to answer phone calls and write text messages. Moreover, he even wrote an autobiography. He did it all by himself. But of course, he cannot do without assistance in life. After graduation, Paul got a permanent assistant, Kathy Gaines, who still takes care of him. Paul and Kathy's acquaintances described their relationship as very close, but not romantic. The man had only one love interest in his entire life, and her name was Claire. He courted her for a long time, and she reciprocated, but they couldn't be together. Today, Paul is 77 years old. He outlived his parents and older brother. He can no longer leave his iron lung. His body became stiff, and he weighs 125 kilograms. The fragile 64-year-old Kathy can't handle him anymore. The big problem for Paul was the 1960s, when the disease receded because a vaccine was developed. Thus, huge devices like the one he was using were no longer needed. Other equipment to help with pulmonary insufficiency has been invented, such that work through a hole in the throat. Paul was also offered to switch to a new method of life support, but he refused. Firstly, he didn't want to make any holes in his body, and secondly, he was already used to his iron lung, and he didn't want to change anything in his life. When Paul's iron lung began to fall apart and his insurance stopped covering its repairs, his friends posted a video online calling for help. It quickly gained several thousands of views, and Brady Richards responded to it. The man was an auto mechanic who loved to build, repair, and modernize everything since childhood. He managed to figure out the device and fix it. As of 2018, there were only 3 people left in the world who were still using the iron lung.